Hello everyone. Thank you so much for clicking on this video and welcome to Across the Board Entertainment. In this video, we're going to be adding another addition to the Bedtime True Crime series. And tonight's bedtime crime story isn't just about murder, it's about warning signs. Because sometimes when we look back at the life of a killer, we ask ourselves one terrifying question. How was this person allowed to keep walking around free long enough to do something even worse? Some criminals seem to come out of nowhere. No obvious past, no long lists of arrests, no flashing neon sign warning the world what they may become. And then there are people like Charles Albright, a man whose past, when you lay it out, reads like a collection of isolated mistakes and more like a series of warnings that were ignored, minimized, excused, or quietly swept under the rug. And somehow through it all, he continued to find his way back into society. At just 13 years old, Albright was accused of aggravated assault. By 15, he had already been convicted in connection with engaging in relations with a woman of the night. At 16, he reportedly contracted an STD, crabs. At 17, he stole money and guns. He went to prison for theft, receiving a 2-year sentence, but was reportedly released after only about 6 months. And then came one of the incidents that, looking back, feels especially disturbing. At 18 years old, after a friend broke up with his girlfriend, Albright allegedly cut the eyes out of the photographs of the young woman and posted them around the friend's dorm. Eyes. He would later become known for something far more horrifying: the EyeBall killer. Albright was eventually expelled from Arkansas State Teachers College, but the problems didn't stop there. Years later, in 1980, at the age of 47, he went back to prison after being convicted of theft involving a saw. In 1981, at 48 years old, he was arrested in connection with the essay of a 9-year-old girl and later pleaded guilty. And in 1985, another accusation involving inappropriate conduct resulted in probation. Not prison, probation. And yet somehow Charles Albright continued building a life around other people. He worked as a teacher. He became involved in his community. He was the head of a Catholic church choir. He was known to families. He reportedly gave people money, handed out boxes of steaks, dressed up as Santa Claus, and gave children gifts. To some, he appeared generous, helpful, even charming. And that's another thing that makes stories like this so unsettling. Sometimes a monster doesn't look like the monster we expect. Sometimes he's standing in the choir. Sometimes he's playing Santa Claus. Sometimes he's the man the neighbor describes as nice. Even after allegations and convictions, there were people who didn't want to believe what they were hearing. The church kept things quiet. No surprise there. Some families were reportedly persuaded to remain silent. And even when rumors and accusations began to surface, there were still people who believed Charles Albright couldn't possibly be capable of such things. But the question remains, how many chances does someone get before the next victim pays the ultimate price? Because Charles Albright was eventually convicted of murder on March 22nd, 1991, but only one murder. But investigators believe the story could be much darker. Tonight, we're talking about Charles Albright, the man known as the EyeBall killer. And as we go through his story, I want you to keep one question in the back of your mind. At what point do warning signs stop being mistakes and start becoming a pattern? So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and settle in. Because tonight's story is proof that sometimes the most frightening part of a true crime case isn't just what the killer eventually did. It's how many times someone had the opportunity to stop him before he became known as a killer. So welcome back to Bedtime Crime Series. And remember, you can go to sleep after this, but don't blame me if you keep the lights on. Let's get into it. Tonight's bedtime crime story takes us to Oak Cliff, Texas, a neighborhood in Dallas where in the early 1990s, women working the streets began disappearing into the night, and then their bodies began reappearing one by one. Shot, beaten, abandoned, and in the most horrifying detail of all, their eyes were missing. Not damaged, not accidentally destroyed, removed. With a precision so disturbing that investigators began to wonder whether their killer had some kind of anatomical knowledge, or perhaps a skill he had been practicing for years. The man eventually arrested was not who many people expected. He was older, soft-spoken, intelligent, a man some people considered respectable, a man who had spent years carefully constructing an image of himself. But according to investigators, behind that image was Charles Albright, a man who would become known by one of the most disturbing nicknames in true crime history, the EyeBall killer. Charles Frederick Albright was born on August 10th, 1933. He was adopted as an infant and raised in Dallas, Texas. From the outside, parts of his early life appeared surprisingly ordinary, but as Charles grew older, a pattern reportedly began to emerge. There were stories of intelligence, charm, the ability to make people like him. But there was also reports of deception, theft, forgery, and increasingly troubling behavior. And then there was something else. Something that years later would take on a much more sinister meaning. Charles Albright had experience with taxidermy. He reportedly learned to preserve animals and work with delicate anatomical features. And according to accounts surrounding the investigation, he had a particular fascination with eyes. Now, that detail alone does not make someone a murderer. But when investigators later examined the bodies of women whose eyes had been removed with chilling precision, that part of Charles Albright's background suddenly became impossible to ignore. One of the most unsettling parts of Charles Albright's story is that the murders did not appear to come out of nowhere. By the time the women of Oak Cliff were being killed, Albright had already had previous encounters with the criminal justice system, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. His history reportedly included offenses involving theft, burglary, and forgery. And there was also allegations and reports of violent and sexually predatory behavior. This is important because so often in true crime we hear the same question: how did nobody know? But sometimes somebody did know something. Sometimes there were warning signs, previous victims, previous arrests, previous crimes, and yet the person continues moving through society until the behavior escalates. And in Charles Albright's case, the contrast between his public image and his alleged private behavior will become a major part of the investigation. Because investigators would later hear from women working in the Oak Cliff area who said they knew him. And some of those women had frightening stories to tell. Stories of a man who could appear friendly one moment and become violent the next. December 1990, Dallas County, Texas. Mary Lou Pratt was a woman working in the Oak Cliff area. Her life was difficult. She lived in an environment where women working the streets were especially vulnerable to violence. And unfortunately, crimes against women in the ladies of the night were not always treated with the urgency they deserved. That vulnerability made them targets. Women could leave with a customer and never be seen again. And sometimes the people around them didn't know immediately whether they had simply gone somewhere or whether something terrible had happened. Then Mary Lou Pratt was found dead. She had been brutally attacked and shot. But during the autopsy, investigators discovered something even more disturbing. Her eyes had been removed. Both of them. The removal was precise enough to suggest that whoever did it had knowledge, skill, or experience working with delicate tissue. This was not just a murder. This was a signature. And at that point, investigators could not have known how significant that signature would become, because Mary Lou Pratt would not be the last woman found this way. Less than 2 months later, another woman was found murdered. Her name was Susan Beth Peterson. Like Mary Lou Pratt, Susan was working in the Oak Cliff area. She too had been shot. And again, investigators found the same horrifying signature. Her eyes had been removed. Now, investigators had a problem. 2 women, similar circumstances, similar victim profiles, similar locations, and a detail so unusual that it could not easily be dismissed as coincidence. This was when the possibility of a serial offender became impossible to ignore. The killer appeared to be selecting vulnerable women, killing them, and leaving behind a signature that was both horrifying and deeply personal. The question was, who was doing this? And even more disturbing, why? Why take the eyes? Why not simply murder and leave? Why perform this additional act after the victim was already gone? Investigators had theories. Some believed the eyes may have been trophies. Others wondered whether the act was connected to sexual violence, control, obsession, or the killer's background in taxidermy. But one of the biggest mysteries of this case remains this: the victim's eyes were never recovered. And to this day, there is no definitive public answer explaining what happened to them. Then, on March 19th, 1991, the killing happened again. Shirley Elizabeth Williams was found dead. Like the women before her, Shirley had been shot. She had suffered violence, and once again, her eyes were gone. But there was something else about this crime scene. The removal appeared less controlled than in the earlier cases. Investigators found evidence suggesting that the killer may have struggled or had difficulty completing the act as clearly as before. And this case would become the most important murder in the prosecution of Charles Albright. Because although he would be connected by investigators to multiple killings, it was Shirley Williams' murder that would ultimately lead to his murder conviction. Now this is where the case starts getting especially interesting. The breakthrough did not come from some magical piece of DNA evidence. It did not come from a killer confession. It came from police work, talking to people, listening, comparing reports, and taking seriously the stories of women who had been victimized and were often ignored. Officers began speaking with women in the Oak Cliff area, and eventually a name began to emerge: Charles Albright. Some women described a man who was older than many of the other customers, a man who had money, a man who drove around the neighborhood, a man who was familiar with the women. And according to testimony and investigative accounts, women described violent encounters involving him. The investigators began looking more closely at Charles Albright, and the more they looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Police searched Albright's home and investigated his movements. According to accounts of the case, investigators found evidence that raised serious questions about his alibi and his behavior. They examined ammunition, receipts, vehicles, personal belongings. They looked at his connection to the neighborhood, and they compared his history with the circumstances surrounding the murders. One detail that reportedly drew attention was unusual ammunition connected to the case. Another was evidence related to his movements that contradicted claims about where he supposedly had been. And then there were stories from the women themselves. Women who said they knew Charles Albright. Women who said he had been violent. Women who in some cases had survived encounters with him. But this was still a complicated case. There was no simple piece of evidence where investigators could say, here is the murder weapon with the victim's blood on it. Much of the prosecution's case was circumstantial, and circumstantial evidence can still be powerful, but it requires investigators and juries to look at the entire picture, not just one piece: the relationships, the behavior, the physical evidence, the timeline, the victim testimony, the forensic findings, and the extraordinary signature connecting the crimes. Charles Albright was arrested in March 1991. He was ultimately charged in connection with multiple murders. The man now sitting in custody was in his late 50s, and to people who knew him casually, the accusations were shocking. This is one of the things that makes cases like this so unsettling. We imagine monsters looking like monsters. We expect evil to announce itself, to wear a warning label. But people who commit terrible crimes can also be charming, helpful, intelligent, polite. They can have family, friends, neighbors who say, "He always seemed so nice." And sometimes that public image is not an accident. Sometimes it's camouflage. Prosecutors believed they had identified the man responsible for the murders, but proving it in court would be another matter. Albright's defense challenged the evidence, and one of the major issues in the case was forensic hair evidence. At the time, hair comparison testimony was presented as part of the case against him. However, years later, further testing called some of that evidence into question. The hairs originally associated with the case were later reported not to have been human hairs. This is an important detail, and I want to pause here because this is exactly why true crime storytelling has to be careful. Charles Albright was convicted of the murder of Shirley Williams. The conviction stands as the central legal outcome of the case. But the evidence used to reach that conviction included forensic methods that were later questioned. That does not automatically mean he was innocent. It does not mean the historical record is more complicated than saying DNA proved everything. It didn't. The case relied heavily on the totality of the evidence, and jurors were asked to decide whether all of those pieces pointed to one man. Charles Albright went to trial for the murder of Shirley Williams. Prosecutors presented their case. They connected Albright to the Oak Cliff area. They presented evidence related to his movements and possessions. They brought forward witnesses. And they painted a picture of a man whose private behavior was far more disturbing than the image he showed to the public. His defense maintained his innocence and challenged the prosecution's evidence. His wife also supported his alibi. But when everything was over, the jury made its decision. On December 18, 1991, Charles Albright was found guilty of the murder of Shirley Williams. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was never convicted of the murders of Mary Lou Pratt or Susan Beth Peterson. And although he was also connected in various accounts to other violent crimes and in earlier homicides, it is crucial to separate suspicion and charges from convictions. Legally speaking, the murder conviction that sent Charles Albright to prison was for Shirley Williams. But investigators and prosecutors believe the pattern of the other killings told a much larger story. Why was he called the EyeBall Killer? It is a nickname that is almost impossible to hear without immediately feeling disturbed. The EyeBall Killer. The name came from the signature found on the victims. the removal of their eyes. But why? That question has never been definitively answered. The eyes were never publicly recovered, and Charles Albright never provided the world with a complete explanation for what investigators believe he had done. Theories remain. Did he keep them as trophies? Was it connected to his experience with taxidermy? Was it an obsession, a ritual, a way to feel power over his victims? We may never know. And sometimes that unanswered question is more disturbing than an answer, because it leaves us with an image of a killer taking something deeply human from his victims and disappearing into the night with it. Charles Albright spent the rest of his life in prison. The man, once able to move freely through the streets of Dallas, was now confined by the very system he had repeatedly encountered throughout his life. He died in prison in 2020 at the age of 87. He took many of his secrets with him. And for the families and loved ones connected to these cases, there would never be a complete explanation for everything that happened. There would be no recovered trophies, no final confession that answered every question, just evidence, court records, investigative files, witness testimony, and the horrifying pattern left behind by the women who crossed paths with him. The Charles Albright case is disturbing for more than one reason. Yes, there is the horrifying signature, the missing eyes, the precision, the mystery of what happened to them. But there is also something else. The question of escalation, the question of warning signs, the question of how many opportunities there may have been to stop a dangerous person before the violence reached its deadliest level. Charles Albright was not convicted of every crime investigators suspected him of committing, and we should always be precise about that. But he was convicted of murder. And the cases of Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Beth Peterson, and Shirley Williams became forever linked by one of the most unusual and disturbing signatures in American true crime. 3 women, 3 brutal murders in a matter of months, and a killer whose identity investigators believed had been hiding behind the face of an ordinary man. So as we close tonight's case files, I want you to remember something. The most dangerous people do not always look dangerous. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they have friends. Sometimes they have families. Sometimes they live ordinary lives right next to the people they hurt. And sometimes the monster is not hiding in the dark. Sometimes he's already been walking among everyone in broad daylight. This has been Bedtime True Crime. If you enjoyed tonight's story, make sure you like, subscribe, and come back for another case file. And until next time, sleep tight, lock your doors, watch your surroundings, comment, and as always, keep those comments cute and classy. Thank you so much for tuning in to Bedtime Crime. a series in the across the board entertainment franchise. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you so much for clicking in this video, and I hope you made it to the end. Again, until next time, bye.